Good question. Why do you think it became so popular in the 19th century to interpret Genesis in such a literal fashion? I'm not a social historian or a Bible historian, so you're getting an amateur's guess here. But one of the things that a lot of theologians have told me is that what many people think is a traditional, literal interpretation of the book of Genesis, among other books, isn't traditional at all. That the early Christian writers, Augustine is a very good example, but there's another writer known as Origen, who's also a good example, didn't read Genesis literally. You saw Augustine sort of warning people against doing that. And the reason for that is very simple, and that is people in the ancient world understood the value of fable, poetry, and allegory. And they understood that you could convey truth by telling a story. Jesus, of course, spoke in parables all the time, intended to convey, even though they weren't true, he would tell a story. Those stories were intended to convey a greater truth. And the argument that I've heard from theologians and scholars of social history is that it was science itself that drove many Christians into reading Scripture, especially Genesis, literally, which is that science relies on literal communication. When you do a scientific experiment, write a scientific paper, you write it out, and man, it's got to mean exactly what it says for the experiment to be reproducible. And that's really when literalism comes into literature and people begin to make this argument. And it's worth noting that the word fundamentalism comes from a series of small books or pamphlets called the Fundamentals of Christianity, which appeared in the late 19th century. They emphasized, among other things, literal readings of certain texts. But even the fundamentals themselves do not make the case for a literal reading in contradiction to evolution of the book of Genesis. So that literal reading is not nearly as traditional as many people